first of all, a big thank you to the organizers of Wisdom 2.0. Every time they put these on, it's such a great service, and we really, really appreciate Soren and everyone else. So the introduction basically was my introduction, which is, why now? I mean, I've been meditating for 45 years, ever since I turned 60. I've been meditating for 45 years and teaching it for almost that long, and there's just been, interest, and then all of a sudden, literally, within the last year or two, there's just spiking of an interest, and not just interest, but wanting to bring meditation, whether it's the VA and the Department of Defense, or it's Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank and all the hedge funds, or professional athletic teams, or now whole schools. And I'm very fortunate to be seated here with two really amazing meditators and exponents of the role of why meditation. And specifically, we're going to be talking about one technique that we have an expertise in, Transcendental Meditation. There are many techniques that all have their value and have different outcomes, but we're talking about the work that we're doing here. And Dr. Suzanne Steinbaum, as a heart specialist, my first question is for you. Why now? Why all of a sudden?
It's funny, when you're speaking, I started, first of all, by the way, Bob is turning 65 years old. And I say that only because I use him as an example of what happens if you meditate your whole life. You look like Bob.
It's true.
You look good.
He looks great.
I feel good. Why now? Why?
In listening to all these companies that have really adopted meditation and wanting it in their businesses is because, not the reason you would think, it's not because they care so much about their employees, but they know what happens from working too hard. They know what happens when people don't take care of themselves, when they don't sleep and eat right, don't get to exercise. They know what happens with the effects of stress. Now, when you have stress on the body, you have a surge of all of these stress hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, that leads to inflammation. This all leads to heart disease and high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, and what happens is that your employees get sick and they're non-productive and they just can't do their job. So instead of saying, let's cut your hours short, go home, exercise, get some rest, what they say is, let's put meditation in and let's see what happens. And what happens is, there's a decrease in all of these stress hormones. There's a reduction in epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol. There is a reduction in high blood pressure. There is an increase in productivity and the ability to focus. And that's what happens with meditation.
But then, so some people would argue, but that's not good, because then the employers can just sort of make you work harder. Is there any upside, spiritually or emotionally for the person who's meditating?
Clearly. But one of the things that happens during the whole process is that as a person, and the reduction of blood pressure, which is so critical, in fact, so much so that in 2013, the American Heart Association used Transcendental Meditation, made a scientific statement that for all people with blood pressure over 120 over 80, Transcendental Meditation should be prescribed. So it definitely has the spiritual effects, it definitely has the physical effects, but one of the other things that it does is it increases productivity. And it does this by calming down the brain. The frontal cortex takes over, and instead of reacting, you can take a time out and respond. And going from reaction to responding thoughtfully and mindfully with a sense of calm changes everything.
And this is a perfect lead into Dov, who is a master of pause, P-A-U-S-E, and the importance of that pause, that moment. And would you please comment, why do you, because we'll first explain what he travels all over the world and he speaks to corporations about behavior and ethics, and will you take it from here?
Well, one way to frame the point I'd like to make is I learned about a 15-year-old girl, Trisha Prabhu, on Twitter just 2 days ago. She's from Naperville, Illinois. And she was really troubled by the increased incidence of cyberbullying, especially after reading about a recent suicide that somebody committed because of cyberbullying online. And she created a software plugin that interacts with text platforms. And every time a child uses a word that is associated with cyberbullying, a pop-up box comes up, and it asks you to pause and ask one question. Are you sure you want to use this word? And cyberbullying has decreased in this way by 93%. Now, this 15-year-old totally understands the world we're living in. I know we feel that it's rapidly increased, and the faster things get, the faster we think we got to go. And maybe it's counterintuitive, but I know not to you all. I think the faster things get, the more we need to not just slow down, but go deeper and go inside ourselves so that we can come outside ourselves and make a difference in the world. And I think that there are 3 trends that are reshaping the world of business, that are making the inner journey facilitated by Transcendental Meditation. And in that regard, thank you for enriching my life, because I've studied and learned so much from you. And the 3 trends, I think, are these. The world has gone from connected to interdependent. We're all in a crowded theater and globally, and we can't shout fire. The behavior of any one person has never been able to affect so many others in ways it never could before. So that's one. The other, it used to be that organizations were vertical. So a military general would say, we're going to take that hill. The soldier's job was to take that hill. A football coach would say, we're going to run that play. Or a CEO would say, these are the numbers we're going to make. And in that world, everybody's job is to do the next thing right. In other words, correctly. Now we're in a world where everybody's job is to not do the next thing right, but to do the next right thing. Because everybody's participating, everybody's tweeting, everybody is called upon to contribute their character, creativity to the job at hand. Now, to do the next right thing, you have to be able to pause. Now, when you hit a pause button on a machine or a computer, it stops. When a human being, when we pause, something amazing happens. We actually start. We reconnect with our values, with beliefs that we hold fundamental. We can think about the ramifications of our behaviors on others, and we can reimagine a better path. And the more interconnected the world gets, the more people are called upon to do not the next thing right, which a computer can do, but the next right thing, the more we need to learn to consciously pause and get in touch. And I think the labor market has shifted. In the industrial age, we hired people for their labor, hired hands. In the knowledge economy, we hired people for cognitive skills, for knowledge, hired heads. But now machines are out processing and out thinking and outsmarting us in many ways. And I think that we're now hiring people for their heart, hired hearts. And there's a Talmudic expression that things that come from the heart enter the heart. And the behaviors we want today that are the new source of competitive advantage, compassion, the ability to innovate with others, to collaborate, etc., only happen if they come from a heart. And I'm sitting next to a doctor, and there's research that shows.
I can't wait to talk.
One last thing as doctors, and we talked about this before. You know that doctors, when they apologize mechanistically, they get sued more after they make a mistake. But when a doctor apologizes from the heart, they get sued less because they've reconnected with the patient. And you're a heart doctor, so you could speak to this.
This is a great
to you. But my
Apologizing?
final point is, if it comes from the heart, it enters the heart. And meditation, in my experience, takes you into the heart.
Okay, before we go to Suzanne, I still find it hard to believe, but maybe it's a generational thing, that people want to hear what you have to say. No, that these banks or these companies, they want to hear, I want to hear, but is it, and maybe this is this change, this relevancy of, tell me about communicating from the heart in business. You work with top companies. Why? You actually said one day, you said everything's exposed now. Everybody, they're looking at the culture behind the app.
Look, who read the story about Amazon on the front page of the New York Times a couple of weeks ago? We are not just X-raying companies. We are MRIing them. We are getting finely tuned, grained insight into the culture. I mean, culture was word of the year in Webster's. So if there's God forbid, a rape on campus, we don't talk about the boy, we talk about fraternity culture. If there's a police chokehold, we're not talking about the cop, we're talking about police culture, celebrity culture, locker room culture, corporate culture, society no longer wants to talk about the apple, but the tree and the roots from which the apple fell. We really want to get deep inside the character of people and institutions. And what lies at the character? Our values. And pausing in meditation puts us on a path to access that, and then translate that back into practices and behaviors that make a difference in the world. And I think that this is practical in that way.
Very practical. Suzanne.
I'm a cardiologist, so let's just start there. But I truly believe that the heart is the center of our own personal universe. That if we actually live from the heart, which is what I always say, if we take care of our hearts, the rest falls into place. There's been studies that have shown that living your life with passion and purpose actually decreases the incidence of heart disease. Now, when you think about that, why would that be true? Our brains, our minds, our beings, how we think, how we feel when we wake up in the morning, is the glass half full or half empty? Optimism, pessimism, anger, hostility, all of these things tie into whether or not you develop heart disease. So if we pay attention to who we are from our metaphorical hearts, how we really believe, how we truly think, and we live from that place, from our hearts with passion and purpose, and with optimism and love and caring and all those other things, we live not only more fulfilling lives, but healthier lives. Meditation ties this together in so many ways. I want to tell my story of yesterday. I spoke to a group of women over the age of 70. And I have a talk about women and heart disease and how it develops uniquely in women. And towards the end of my talk, I talk about the connection between the mind and the heart. And before I got to talk about meditation, a woman who was the oldest woman in the room, she was 85, she was glowing and just so put together and bright. And she raised her hand and she said, "Well, what about transcendental meditation?" And I went, that was my next sentence. And I said, "Tell me what you know." She was practicing for 35 years. And it was one of those moments that I actually get to have quite often where I could say, and that's what happens, and that's what happens. It ties together your whole being. It ties together who you are and allows you to live from the heart. And I can't fully explain why. And I say this to you all the time, that I don't know and I cannot tell you why it does that, but it does.
I agree, it does.
I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about this. Pause just for a second. And then I want you to comment, and I want you to talk about what happened in the crash and the heart. You know, the guy in 2008, people were feeling, I don't want to give it away.
Okay. What crash?
This whole idea of the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, size of your fist behind your forehead, and that is executive functioning, and that's said to govern decision-making and planning and judgment and sense of self and ethical reasoning, but it's also the rational filter against impulsive decisions. And then there's another part of the brain called the amygdala, which is the fear center, probably you all know this, the fear center or fight or flight, and that's impulsivity. And when a person is anxious or stressed or traumatized, the frontal lobes go offline and the amygdala gets hyper-aroused. And I head up the David Lynch Foundation and filmmaker David Lynch, and in the last 10 years we've provided scholarships for over 500,000 inner city school kids to learn to meditate. Not just in the United States, but on the West Bank and in Uganda and Rwanda and all over Latin America. And because it has the effect, when you meditate, when the mind settles down, of strengthening the neural pathways, that basically the frontal lobes goes, I'm going to get to a point here, frontal lobe comes online, and the amygdala sort of resets itself. And the reason I tell you this is I was teaching in San Francisco, there's 5,000 kids who participate in a Lynch Foundation-sponsored quiet time. There's about 7 public schools where the kids meditate at the beginning of the school day, at the end of the school day. And I taught this one kid who was really the bully, and Jerome, and I asked him, but when Jerome started, then all the other kids wanted to start. And when I asked him afterwards, I said, well, how's it going? And he said, well, Mr. Roth, used to be that when I walked down the hall, if someone bumped into me, I'd slug them. And I said, well, now you've been meditating a week. Now what happens is now I walk down the hall, someone bumps into me. He said, I stop for a moment, and then I slug them. The ending to the story is, I saw him a month later, and he's like, it's not even an issue. This school, Visitation Valley School in South San Francisco near the Cow Palace, the school just transformed, and now they've got photography clubs, and they've got math clubs, and the whole school has been transformed. And one of the worst schools in the city has become in the upper middle. I'm not going to say it's the great, but it's come up to the upper middle in 2 years. And the superintendent of schools said it's the single most important educational innovation that he has seen in 30 years.
Yeah.
Your comment?
Mike.
Just say yeah. No.
Pause longer before you take a punt. No, but think of it, if you step back, I think today the largest challenge and problem facing business is that 7 out of 10 employees, pretty much worldwide, certainly in the US, are disengaged on the job. And 2 out of those 7 are so disengaged that they're sabotaging their company. They're on Facebook saying some pretty nasty things. That's $400 billion in lost productivity. That's not just a jobs crisis. These are people with a job who are leaning out, not leaning in, and not creating jobs through their discretionary effort and innovation for their uncles and brothers and sisters and friends. 6 out of 10 consumers are not engaged with the companies they shop with because they don't trust them and they cite broken promises. And 3 out of 4 citizens are not engaged with government. So even though the world is connected, we are disconnected from institutions fundamentally because we don't trust leadership. And I think the largest business problem is a human problem, that people's heart, they don't care enough. And until we create institutions that re-engage the heart, and the 3 reasons that people lean out and not in are disengaged, first and foremost is a low trust environment. Secondly, it's not a values-based environment. They don't think that there's enough honesty and fairness. And third, they've shifted away from just conventional success, and they're not engaged because they don't find meaning. Now, that means that we need to both go on a personal journey to rediscover and awaken meaning, but then create marriages between our sense of purpose and sense of what's right, and institutions' values and what they're trying to do in the world. And until we bring those together, I think that the business problem won't be solved. Meditation, pausing, asking deep questions. What am I on earth to do? What is right and wrong besides it feels right? What argument can I make? Building that muscle on the inside is what we're going to need to create value on the outside. And I just think that it's just part of what's going on, and business leaders that I'm in touch with, they get it. They're trying to rehook the heart of consumers and employees.
What is the relationship between a stressed individual and a person who's able to think ethically or profoundly or have insight? The person that Dov is talking about. Is stress a barrier to that?
This is the story that you're referring to. Yeah. It was amazing. How many years ago was that now? Before the stock market crashed. I will never forget it. It was right before, it was during the summer. And I had a whole host of people coming in from Wall Street with chest pain, shortness of breath, high blood pressure, and they were manic. They're like, you don't know what's about to happen. I'm telling you, you don't know what's about to happen. And the stress of life was manifesting right in front of my eyes. There's a desperation, there's a reactivity, there's a disconnect. There are all of those things. I was thinking about this also. When you don't feel well and you go to work, you might be a little on edge. Imagine having stress in your system It's like shaking up a can of carbonated soda. It's going to explode. It can't respond rationally and thoughtfully. And that's what I kept seeing come in my office. They were sick, not only physically, mentally, and their souls were sick. You can't connect, you can't respond, you can't act
And
ethically.
to the extreme end of that, I was invited to talk to the benefits person of one of the large banks. They have 200,000 employees. And a similar question, I said, well, why now? You know, the problem, stress has been for a long time in your bank. And she said, well, this isn't something we'll tell the press, but we have too many suicides.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the bad press from suicides.
Wow.
And it was like, that sentence right there, there's a lot of disgusting, bad press, there's a lot wrong with that sentence. But it's just that death, it's coming, it's exploding, and it's killing people. Dov.
And making people cut corners along the way, too. Because when you're under stress, I mean, the pressure of the vicissitudes of life, the pressure to get the job done, are to be pragmatic, expedient. You know, doing the right thing is what you do if it feels inconvenient, unpopular, maybe a little unprofitable in the short term. And if you don't pause and get centered, you won't have the strength to do what's right, irrespective of the stress you're having. But we have to work on the culture, because it shouldn't be so hard to stop and get in touch with what's right versus wrong. It shouldn't be so hard to be thoughtful before you hit send or before you tweet. It shouldn't be so hard to say, how is the recipient of this email going to internalize what I'm trying to communicate? So we also have to create environments where people can access, you know, their inner truths in that way.
In the last minute, I just want to give an example, a metaphor that I use when I explain meditation. I tell people you're on a little boat and you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and all of a sudden you get these giant waves. And you could think, swells, 40-foot swell, you could think the whole ocean is in upheaval, and it feels that way. But the word whole ocean is a bit of an exaggeration, because if you did a cross-section of the ocean, you'd realize you got these little itty-bitty 30-foot waves, and the ocean in reality is a mile deep. And at the depth of the ocean, it's pretty darn quiet. One time I said, it's quiet, silent, and a little 10-year-old said, no, Mr. Roth, there's fissures down there. So it's pretty darn quiet down there. And I use the analogy to the mind. The surface of the mind is the active thinking monkey mind, the gotta mind. And we all want, you know, some inner calm, some inner peace, some inner access to reservoirs, and we hypothesize that deep within every one of us is a level of the mind right now that is already and always calm. Pure consciousness, whatever you want to call it, it's there. It's who we are. And meditation gives access to that. And I want to conclude, because Sharon Salzberg is here, who I adore, and is a great leader. Are you over there? Yes. And there are other wonderful meditation teachers here, and I think that now is the time that it's like someone said, well, I do TM and I don't do mindfulness. I said, nah. There's a big war out there with stress. We should learn and become masters of as many tools as we can that can help us overcome stress and raise our performance and become the type of person that these two wonderful people are speaking, the type of people that we would like to be. So my final word is, whatever you're doing, if you're meditating, do more, be more regular. And if you're regular, look into more, because there's wonderful value, and we thank the organizers and Soren very much for giving us this opportunity to speak.